They found him just after sunrise, crouched beneath the collapsed bell tower of St. Aveline's orphan sanctuary. The Union Patrol, passing through the scorched lowlands of South Carolina in early May of 1865, had expected nothing more than ash and silence. The war had already eaten this place. Vines strangled the church's broken arches, the brick walls sagged inward like a mouth too tired to scream. Crows circled but never landed, as if even carrion was afraid to settle there. And then came the sound, barely more than a breath, a soft scratching behind the rubble, steady and mechanical like a quill against parchment. When they pulled back the soot-blackened timber, there he was. A boy, barefoot and shirtless, his skin gray with dust, his limbs stick-thin and trembling as if barely stitched together. The child's records, discovered later in a drawer warped from fire, listed his name as Peter Ellery, aged 6. But the boy beneath the bell tower did not look 6. He looked 15, maybe 16, his spine hunched as if gravity had grown heavier on him alone. His hair, once described as chestnut in the orphanage's admission ledger, had turned shock white. His eyes were not closed nor open. They stared as if caught between dimensions, as if frozen mid-blink in a dream no one else could enter. He said nothing. He just kept drawing. In the ash-covered dirt, his fingers moved in small, jerking motions, tracing symbols over and over again. Circles enclosed in thorns, limbs drawn backward, hollow squares with no doors. Some were geometric and cruel in shape, others soft and curving like body parts turned inside out. One soldier, older than the rest and already lost to drink, whispered that the symbols resembled parts of the human nervous system. Only wrong. Like a child's sketch of a brain stripped of compassion. They tried to feed him, water him, and speak to him. Nothing changed. He moved only to draw, and when his fingers bled, he kept going with the tip of a broken nail. When the patrol's physician tried to lift him, Peter shrieked, not in pain or protest, but as if someone else had screamed through him. The men dropped him instantly. The scream had come from deep in his chest, but didn't match the pitch of a child's voice. It was older, hollow, starved. Some believed it was the wind echoing through the broken tower. Others didn't speak of it at all. Inside what remained of the chapel, signs of hurried abandonment spoke louder than any witness. Bunk beds still made, bowls of dried oats untouched on the floor. Tiny shoes lined up along the wall as if waiting for feet that had never returned. But there were no bodies, no graves, no blood, just emptiness layered with dust and the faint scent of burnt oil and damp stone. The altar had been scraped clean. Even the cross was missing. Where it should have hung, a crude shape was burnt into the wall. 9 vertical lines, each intersected by a curved slash at varying angles, like someone counting backward from a number that no longer existed. The only name found in the registry that matched a current child was Peter's, and it listed his last known guardian as Father Josiah Elgin, the head of the orphanage, presumed dead in the final year of the war. A few townspeople recalled the name but said the man had grown strange after the second winter. Spoke too much of sacrifice and suffering and how children were the purest vessels for correction. Later that night, in the makeshift medical tent set up just outside the sanctuary ruins, Peter finally moved his eyes. He looked directly at one of the nurses as she whispered a prayer under her breath. He blinked, and for a split second it seemed he recognized her, not as a person but as a sound. Then, without warning, he turned his wrist and drew one final symbol in the dirt beside his cot. It was a bell, but the clapper was missing, and instead, inside the hollow dome, was the shape of an eye, closed tight. After that, he never moved again, not in body, not in my mind. The soldiers took him north to a hospital in Virginia, but no recovery came, only silence. And when his fingernails regrew, they say he scratched the same eye onto his wooden bed frame, again and again, until there was no wood left. That was the last anyone ever found at St. Aveline's. No graves, no answers. Just a boy who aged 9 years in one night and never spoke again. He had once been beloved. Before the war clawed across the land like an open wound, Josiah Elgin was known in the Low Country as a gentle shepherd of broken souls. His sermons were soft and strange, less about fire and brimstone, more about stillness, purification, and the cleansing that could come through silence. When the first sons died in battle and the fields turned to graves, it was Elgin who comforted the weeping mothers and opened the doors of St. Aveline's to the war's smallest casualties. By the time the Confederacy began to collapse, the chapel had become an orphan sanctuary in name but not in spirit. 15 children remained, 15 mouths to feed, 15 eyes that watched him without blinking, waiting for him to lead when there was nothing left to follow. His journal begins clean. The early pages, dated mid-1864, are neat, composed, and strangely bureaucratic. Lists of rations, logs of bedding rotations, temperature readings, prayers for strength. He recorded everything. Even the number of times each child blinked during prayer. Even the weight of their hair clippings. Even the way their teeth aligned. Every child was given a number in ink, never names, because Elgin believed names carried sins passed down through blood. By October, the ink turns darker. The handwriting is tighter. Rations dwindle. The entry on the 14th notes the burial of a cow in the chapel garden and a line that reads, "Flesh made sacred is never wasted." But no cow is listed in the earlier inventory. Elgin begins writing about purity in ways that feel warped, how hunger was a sacred test of character, how silence let divine design move through children untouched. He praised one child for not speaking a single word for 5 days and punished another for singing to herself in sleep. His punishments were not beatings or scoldings, they were rituals. The inventory lists them. Isolation under fasting for 72 hours. Wax sealing of mouth, symbolic. Reversal breathing posture. Each child was made to wear a thin black veil over their face during these acts. He called them blessings in shadow. They were forbidden to look at one another. Forbidden to sleep at the same time. Forbidden to remember their lives before entering the sanctuary. Each week, the journals note a correction ritual that lasted precisely 7 hours, no matter the season, weather, or condition of the children. One of the most chilling entries is dated January 3rd, 1865. It's titled "Reckoning in the Flesh." Elgin writes of dividing the orphans into 3 groups: the watched, the watching, and the willing. He believed that only those who had witnessed evil but chosen stillness could ascend. The watches were locked in the bell tower overnight, tied facing outward toward the empty chapel. The watching stood in the rafters with their eyes held open by fish hooks and linen thread. And the willing? Their section of the page is redacted, soaked through with what appears to be blood. All Elgin writes is their silence was perfect, their eyes shone, They have begun to glow beneath the skin. The next set of entries no longer document food or weather. Instead, they list phrases that repeat obsessively. The body must be reversed. The soul must sleep inside the spine. Children are the clearest mirrors. One note mentions a Sabbath of stillness in which all children were ordered to lie face down on the stone floor for 14 hours straight, while Elgin walked among them humming what he called the inversion hymn. One child who tried to stand reportedly lost consciousness. Another convulsed but was recorded as purged of his mother's scream. There are sketches, too, dozens of them, embedded between the entries. Not artistic drawings, but surgical outlines. Diagrams of human bodies folded inward, spines bent into crucifix shapes, lungs repositioned beneath the tongue, jaws sewn shut from the inside. He annotated each with spiritual rationale, notes that suggest he believed the physical reordering of the body could realign a child's soul to match the divine template he saw in dreams. He wasn't just keeping records, he was building a theology out of control. By late February, the journal shifts into almost total mania. Entries become single sentences written hundreds of times. They do not belong to time anymore. The bell shall toll in reverse. God hides inside the smallest voice. One entry lists all 15 children by number, followed by a single word beside each, words like ready, folded, hollow, and listening. Only 2 are left blank. The final page is dated the night the Union Patrol later estimated the orphanage fell silent. It simply reads, "All vessels have been sealed. The altar is within." Beneath that, drawn in precise lines, is the same eye-shaped bell symbol Peter would later trace into the dirt. The clapper gone, the lid shut, the eye closed forever. Elgin himself was never found. Neither was a single child's body. Only the journal remained buried beneath the pulpit in a steel lockbox welded shut from the inside. And though historians call it madness, though clergy condemn it as heresy, not one line has been proven false. The inventory was exact, unflinchingly detailed, cold. And for some, that was what made it worse. Evil that breathes is terrifying. But evil that documents itself, that accounts, that catalogs, that organizes its cruelty with quiet, unshaking hands, that is something else entirely. His name was Emil Richter, a quiet man from Lucerne who had wandered south after the war's thunder passed. Known for his skill with rare pendulum clocks and the delicate work of gear harmonics, he traveled with little more than a tool kit, a folded wool coat, and a silver monocle etched with numbers too small for anyone but him to read. When he arrived at St. Aveline's in late December of 1864, the chapel was already half dead. The bell tower hadn't rung in nearly a year. Locals said it had seized during a storm, frozen at midnight, and Father Elgin, claiming it was a sign, forbade anyone from touching it. But then he summoned Richter weeks after silence had become a law within the chapel walls. Richter accepted the invitation, though no one remembered seeing who delivered it. He spent 2 days studying the gears, moving like a surgeon through dust and disuse. At first he noted the expected wear, friction, rust, and signs of forced stopping. But then he saw something wrong. The bell's clapper was suspended not by rope or pulley, but by a series of tightly wound iron chains. Some no thicker than a finger, others thick enough to anchor a horse. These weren't mechanical supports. They had been fused into the structure, linked through the gear system, wound between the chimes, bolted into wood as if someone wanted the bell to be both still and screaming at the same time. Etched into the chain links were small, deliberate marks, tiny grooves that, under magnification, resembled spinal vertebrae. 33 of them aligned in sequence. On the second night, he opened the housing for the tower's primary pendulum, expecting a counterweight system. Instead, he found a long brass rod, perfectly balanced with carvings that mimicked the human spine. Each vertebra was labeled in a ciphered Latin dialect, and the pendulum didn't swing. It swayed inward, concave like something bowing under invisible pressure. Beneath it lay a cushion of black velvet, slightly stained, with a faint imprint in the shape of a curled body. Richter didn't sleep that night. He returned to the bell, took sketches, and wrote notes in Swiss German that read like warnings. Phrases such as mechanical alignment with anatomical consequence, and this is no instrument of time. He seemed disturbed, and those who saw him that morning said he kept whispering calculations to himself that didn't add up. He vanished the next day. His tools remained untouched. His sketches were left scattered across the chapel pews, pages torn as if from panic. The velvet cushion beneath the pendulum was missing. Father Elgin told the children Richter had completed his work and moved on, though no horses were heard, no wheels on the road. His name was never entered in town registries. The bell never rang again. But years later, in the stillest hour of night, some claimed they could feel something shift in the ground below the tower, like the spine of the earth itself was ticking. Beneath the sanctuary, down a narrow staircase no wider than a coffin, lay a root cellar that had long ago rotted into disuse. Father Elgin repurposed it, not as storage but as a holy chamber. In his journal he referred to it only as the room of stillness. It was there that he constructed the silence boxes, 4 in total, each no larger than a child's grave. Built from the pews of the old chapel, the boxes were lined with black velvet salvaged from altar cloths, their interiors made soft not with cushioning, but with fragments of bones pressed into the walls. Animal bones at first, later not. He believed suffering must begin with absence, that when sound, light, and touch were taken from a child, the soul would uncoil and speak plainly. He said the silence made room for revelation. The children were not told how long they would stay inside. That was part of the design. They were lowered one at a time into the box, arms crossed, eyes blindfolded, mouths gently sealed with wax-soaked linen. Once sealed inside, they were laid flat and bound loosely, not tight enough to restrict breathing, but firm enough to erase the sense of movement. A sliver of air came through a carved hole shaped like a keyhole above their heads. No light passed through, no sound. Just breathe, just pulse, just waiting. The first child lasted 3 hours before they began screaming, though no one outside could hear. When finally removed, the child convulsed on the floor, eyes rolled back, tongue chewed nearly in half. Elgin called it resistance leaving the flesh. That child was not chosen again. But others were. He kept notes on each, how long they lasted, what they said afterward, whether they wept, whether they prayed. He noticed patterns. Children who had been disciplined harshly before the war seemed to break quickly. But those who had known comfort and known kindness resisted longer. And when they did, finally, shatter, they emerged quieter than the rest. After repeated sessions, some children began to smile when placed into the box. Not with joy, but with eerie calm. One boy whispered afterward that he had seen his mother's hand, only it had too many fingers. Another claimed to hear music from under the floor, soft organs humming backward. The most alarming were the ones who came out with no memory at all of what had happened inside. They walked straighter, ate slower, obeyed instantly. Elgin wrote that these were the closest to the divine. Each box was named after a different virtue: patience, purity, silence, and devotion. He recorded which child best fit each one. Over time, some children were repeatedly assigned to the same box. Others were rotated. Some were sent in pairs, back to back, never seeing or touching one another, only breathing the same air through slits in the wall. Afterward, they would speak in unison, finish each other's sentences, and blink at the same time. Elgin called it soul synchronization. He believed this was a path to absolution, not for the children but for the world. That through their stillness the noise of mankind could be quieted. His final note in that chapter of the journal stated, "When a child stops crying in the dark, the heavens hold their breath." And indeed, some children never cried again. Not in the dark, not ever. They moved as if underwater, never raising their voices, never flinching when touched. They had become silent, not from fear but from transformation. No bodies were found in the boxes, but deep scratches inside the wood grain beneath the velvet suggest that silence was not always welcome. Some fingernails were still embedded in the corners. Others were filed smoothly. Once names were removed, identity no longer mattered. Father Elgin believed that names held the rot of lineage, corruption passed down from parent to child like rust in blood. He replaced each name with a saint number, burnt into the wooden collar every child was forced to wear. These were not biblical saints nor martyrs of church doctrine, but invented figures imagined through Elgin's fevered theology. Saint 1 was for the silent. Saint 5 was for those who had sinned without knowing how. Saint 9, Elgin whispered to no one in particular, was not meant to survive. The children were told that sainthood was not earned through goodness but through obedience in suffering. Each number became a symbol not of status but of purpose. The rituals came every Sunday without fail. He called them the feasts of the nameless saints. The chapel, dimly lit and sealed from the outside, was transformed into a place of grotesque communion. Children were dressed in burlap robes, hands bound behind their backs and lips rubbed with bitter oil to numb the tongue. One by one they were brought before the altar and forced to kneel. Elgin prepared the offering himself in a large stone bowl that had once been used for baptisms. The mixture was always the same: crushed garden flowers, wilted and gray, mixed with powdered chalk scraped from the chapel's crumbling walls, stirred together with the ground bodies of cleansed insects he kept in small jars labeled with words like humble, penitent, and necessary. He claimed the insects were chosen, drowned in vinegar, then smoked in incense until their bodies curled like script. The communion was thick and bitter, force-fed through carved wooden spoons with cracked edges that often bloodied the children's mouths. Many gagged, some vomited. The response, Elgin said, was sacred either way. He kept records of who swallowed easily, who resisted, and who trembled. It was not about nutrition, it was about transformation. The children were never allowed to wipe their faces afterward. He insisted they keep the remains of the ritual on their lips and chins as a sign of their purification. Over time, the effects changed. Children who had once been merely frightened began showing signs of deeper damage. Bleeding from the ears became common. Some reported hearing bells at night that no longer existed. Others said they saw shapes crawling across the walls, even in daylight, shapes with too many joints, always moving just out of reach. One girl began humming backwards hymns in her sleep, even though she had never been taught the words. Elgin watched these changes with fascination, calling them saintly signs. He believed they were glimpses into the new soul forming within. Then during the sixth feast, something happened that Elgin did not record. Saint Aveline, a boy no older than 7, began convulsing after communion. His body seized violently, lips frothing black. As the children were let out, he vomited a thick tar-like wax onto the chapel floor. It smelt like hot stone and old blood. Before anyone could respond, he stood up, walked silently to the altar, and vanished behind it. Not run. Vanished. There was no sound, no resistance, and no evidence he ever reached the wall. When the others searched for him, they found only his collar, Saint Aveline, laid neatly atop the wax pool as if returned to inventory. Elgin wrote nothing of the event, not even a mention in the journal margins. But from that day forward, he conducted the feasts in silence. No chants, no hymns, just spoon after spoon, mouth after mouth, and the growing certainty that whatever was being fed wasn't meant to nourish but to open something old and listen. The mirror had not been placed, it had been found. Hidden behind a rotting velvet curtain in the chapel's deepest basement, propped against the stone wall with no frame, no markings, and no dust, though the rest of the basement choked with mildew and rot. It was one of the children who discovered it, Saint 14, a girl whose real name had long been erased. She had been sent below to fetch a bucket of chalk dust for Elgin's next communion mixture. Instead, she returned with wide eyes and silent hands, trembling but calm, as if she had just seen something ancient exhale. That night she refused to eat. Instead she drew, on scraps of parchment on her bedding, on the soles of her feet, faces but not as they were. The drawing showed heads with smooth skin where the features should be. No eyes, no noses, no mouths, just blank ovals, peaceful, waiting. She drew dozens before she slept, her hands shaking like leaves held too long in the wind. When Elgin saw the drawings, he didn't punish her. He praised her. He said this was the truest kind of vision, free from distraction, free from sin. He asked her to take him to the mirror. She obeyed. Others followed. They stood in silence before it, waiting for their reflections to meet them, but the mirror did not show what it should. It was removed. At first just the eyes, then the mouths. Then even the shapes of the skulls seemed to soften. The reflections became faceless, not just empty but erased, as if the glass were showing a version of them that had been cleaned of history, of guilt, of thought. Some of the younger children cried. Others reached toward the glass, trying to understand if what they saw was them or something else wearing their shape. Elgin watched this with reverence. He began calling the mirror the veil. He told the children that what they saw in it was their true form, and that only those worthy could be seen by the divine. He forbade them from using their own names even in thought. In morning lessons, he taught them to draw without eyes, without mouths, They practiced until their hands bled, until the chapel walls were lined with paper after paper of faceless saints. The children stopped making noise unless spoken to. Some covered their faces with cloth during meals. One by one, they began asking to sleep in the basement near the mirror. Over the next week, the mirror was found in different places than where it had been left. Once leaning against the altar, once beneath a child's bed, and once hanging in the dining hall, though no one recalled moving it. Elgin believed it was moving of its own accord, drawn toward the most faithful. He called these appearances visitations and recorded them with the same care as communion rituals. But the longer the mirror stayed near the children, the stranger they became. A few began tilting their heads when spoken to, as if listening through walls. Others blinked out of sync, their mouths hanging open even when not breathing. One morning, St. Two was found sitting motionless at the foot of the chapel stairs. His hands were coated in dried ink. Dozens of faces had been drawn on the stone beside him, some with eyes scratched out violently, others smeared to the point of erasure. He had torn off his own collar. When asked why, he simply whispered, "He sees better when we don't." After that, Elgin declared mirrors sacred and destroyed all others in the chapel, except the one without a face. That one, he said, had become a window to what waited behind the veil, a presence that wanted silence, stillness, and most of all, faces it could shape for itself. The entrance was hidden beneath the pulpit, sealed beneath a false floorboard that groaned when stepped on in a certain rhythm. It led to a narrow stone shaft, carved by hand and slick with condensation, that dropped deep beneath the chapel's foundation into a chamber that had no record in any blueprint. Its walls were lined with iron. Thick slabs fused together with old rivets and bolts that bore no maker's mark. The air inside was still and heavy, saturated with the copper sting of rust and something far older. At the center sat a shallow iron basin discolored from decades of scorched liquid. It was surrounded by 7 stone steps, each carved with phrases in reversed Latin, their letters uneven, as if etched by a trembling hand in darkness. This was the chamber of baptism, though it held no water blessed by God. Father Elgin referred to it as the womb of heat and believed it was the place where innocence was stripped, not for forgiveness but for transformation. The basin was filled not with holy water but with a mixture of boiled well water, crushed bone ash, and tinctures extracted from burnt scripture. The temperature was raised until it steamed without boiling, just enough to blister but not kill. Children were brought in one by one, stripped of all clothing, blindfolded, and placed into the basin while hymns were whispered backward in Elgin's voice alone. He said they had to be made skinless in spirit before any true purity could take root. The baptisms left scars, always in patterns. Elgin used metal stencils shaped like crucifixes, halos, and veiled faces. He would press them against the children's shoulders, spines, and chests while reciting what he called the reverse commandments. No blood was allowed to spill during the rites. Only steam. If a child cried out, the ritual would restart. He believed silence preserved the shape of pain more faithfully than sound ever could. Some children fainted and awoke changed, calmer, quieter, but unable to look anyone in the eyes. A few were never seen again. Others emerged altered in less visible ways. One girl refused to speak except in numbers. One boy walked with his arms crossed over his chest for the rest of his life, even in sleep. Another child, after his second baptism, refused to eat unless the food was first placed on the chamber's floor. But the strangest case was Saint Six. After surviving 3 baptisms, his skin was marked with symmetrical scars along his back that resembled wings, though not angelic. More insect-like. He stopped speaking altogether except for one instance where he whispered, "It's quiet in there." When asked why, he stared for hours at the locked floor hatch. He had begun scratching the iron steps with his nails, carving the same spiral over and over again. Eventually, he begged Elgin to return him to the chamber, not for punishment, but for peace. Elgin allowed it. He was never seen again. What disturbed later investigators wasn't just the condition of the chamber or the smell of scorched oil that never faded. It was the journal entry found wedged into the cracked mortar behind the basin. Written in Elgin's hand, it read, "Pain opens the skin, but heat opens the inside of time. I have seen them beneath the iron. They do not scream. They wait. They wait for more." The chamber was resealed, but the stones beneath the basin stayed warm for years, even after the building above had collapsed. No matter the season, the iron always sweated. And somewhere in the dark, the steps still bore the shape of small feet, perfectly spaced as if someone had just walked in and not yet walked out. It began without warning. One morning in late October, frost appeared across the chapel's windows, veining through the glass like fingers pressing from the outside. At first, it was dismissed as seasonal drift, a rare cold snap. But by the 3rd week, the snow began falling. Not in flurries, not in storms, but in a steady, whispering descent that blanketed the ground without pause. Elgin wrote in his ledger that God has stilled the air to listen more clearly. The townsfolk thought it strange, but they had stopped asking questions about the chapel long before. What concerned them more was that the snow never melted, not even by fire. The ground remained frozen even when the sun returned. But the sun didn't return often. Days passed where no light broke through the sky, only a dim blue haze that gave no warmth. The crops withered, birds vanished, and even the insects seemed to disappear into the earth. More disturbing was what happened to the animals. Several were found mid-stride in the woods, deer, foxes, even a wild dog, frozen solid as if caught mid-motion. One had half a step imprinted in the snow as though something had taken the next moment from it. The wind carried no scent, no sound traveled far. The air became a weight, thick and listening. Inside the orphanage, things grew stranger. The children who once marked the passing of time through chores and punishments began to lose their sense of days altogether. Elgin stopped keeping calendar records. He claimed time had entered retreat. The children stopped growing, their hair did not lengthen, their teeth did not fall out or come in. Fingernails stayed the same. A few stopped eating entirely, yet showed no signs of weakness. They sat by the windows, watching the snow fall with vacant eyes, whispering to no one. When asked what they were looking at, one child said simply, "The snow." And then came the overnight change. One of the smallest, Saint 12, had been nearly 5 years old for what Elgin believed to be close to a year. When he was put to bed, he still wore the linen tunic of a toddler. When the children found him the next morning, his cot was shattered. The boy had aged, not gradually but violently. His body now matched that of a 15-year-old, limbs long and bent, spine curved awkwardly like it had stretched too fast. His hair had gone completely white. His mouth hung slightly open, eyes fixed forward, skin tight over unfamiliar bones. He did not speak, he did not blink. Elgin called it the sudden ripening. He claimed it was proof of divine intervention. But the other children began weeping when they saw him, not out of fear but recognition, like they'd seen that face in dreams they weren't supposed to remember. The logs recovered later were water-damaged, with most of the ink blurred. But one phrase appeared again and again in Elgin's notes during the snow period: the season of still time. He believed the snow was not weather, but evidence that time itself had stopped its flow above ground and coiled beneath. A long sleep, a divine pause. In one passage he wrote, "To escape the scream of clocks, one must enter the hush where age is a choice, not a rule." The snow lasted 6 months by Elgin's measure, though no one outside could verify the span. When it finally stopped, it didn't melt. It simply vanished. One morning to the next, the ground bare, the air warm again. But nothing inside the chapel changed. The children did not regain their voices. The aged boy never moved again. And in the woods beyond the chapel, the frozen animals remained untouched, still locked in mid-motion, waiting for a season that would never come. It was found sealed beneath the altar inside a box wrapped in stitched fabric that had once been part of a child's robe. The lock had rusted shut, but the fabric had not decayed. Inside was the book, small, thick, heavy as bone. Its cover had no title, no cross, and no embossing. Just the feel of something wrong. The surface was smooth in parts, wrinkled in others, like skin pulled too tight over uneven shapes. Experts would later argue about its origin. Some claimed it was an animal hide. Others suggested something older, possibly ceremonial. But the edges of the cover were unmistakable, fingertip ridges, a faint curve of a palm. The book had been bound in flesh. The first pages were dense with scripture, but not as it was known. The language mimicked holy text, echoing the cadence of psalms and epistles, but with disturbing inversions. Where the Bible spoke of mercy, this one demanded offerings. Where it spoke of grace, it asked for subtraction. One passage read, "Blessed are the hollow, for they shall echo with his need." Another instructed the removal of self not through prayer, but through the taking of another's silence. The margins were filled with smaller writings, scrawled in uneven ink. Childlike notes, prayers written backward, tiny phrases such as "he sees through bone," and "if I'm clean enough, I won't come back wrong." The pages were stiff, with moisture long dried. Some stuck together at the corners. What horrified investigators most wasn't the text. It was the texture of the pages themselves. Nearly every leaf bore the imprint of small fingers, some smeared, some pressed with careful force, as if the children who touched it had been told to hold each word tightly. Near the center of the book there were indentations in the shapes of teardrops. Actual moisture once absorbed into the page, leaving permanent stains that shimmered faintly in low light, as if sorrow itself had been made into ink, and in a way it had. Forensic analysis revealed that the ink was not entirely plant-based or traditional. It contained human calcium, fragments of enamel and dentin, ground down and mixed with oil to create the ink's distinct sheen. The book had been written with the crushed teeth of children. The rewritten gospel included diagrams, twisted renderings of communion tables, altars inverted like traps, and a recurring symbol. The eyeless bell ringing in silence, always centered above the phrase, "He does not knock, he is already inside." Scholars noted that the narrative arc of the book followed a structure of ritual, not theology. There was no redemption, no resurrection, only refinement through pain. Elgin had not rewritten scripture to teach. He had rewritten it to mirror the system he'd built, the cold, mechanical process of purification by subtraction. One final note was found tucked into the back cover, a piece of folded parchment too brittle to unfold without breaking. What little could be read spoke of a gospel without forgiveness, only forgetting. The Flayed Gospel was sealed in a federal archive within a month of its discovery. But copies appeared in underground collections within years, and once read, it is said, the blank parts begin to rewrite themselves, only this time in your own voice. They called him the Hollow Boy, though his name had once been Peter. He hadn't spoken in years, not since the day they pulled him from beneath the collapsed bell tower with white hair, aged limbs, and eyes that looked too far backward to see what was in front of him. For nearly a decade he remained motionless in a sanatorium room that faced nothing. He neither wept nor smiled. He ate only when spoon-fed, blinked less than he should have, and flinched only when bells rang outside the window. But one winter, without warning, he moved. He raised a hand and pointed toward the floor. When staff cleared the dust beneath his bed, they found a drawing scratched into the wood. 9 lines intersected by backward curves, the same symbol burnt into the chapel wall where the altar once stood. When asked what it meant, Peter finally opened his mouth. His voice was dry, distant, and cracked with rust. He said, "It was the night we lied backward." It took weeks to gather what remained of his memory. He spoke slowly, painfully, as if each word was pulled from some deep place that had forgotten how to bleed. He described a ritual called the Night of Reversal, a ceremony that Elgin had devised during the final months of the orphanage. It was meant to cleanse the children of hidden corruption, not by exposing their sins, but by forcing them to invent them. Each child was given parchment and ink and told to write a lie, a sin they had not committed. The more innocent they were, the harder it was. And that, Elgin claimed, was the test. Peter remembered the cold room where it took place, long tables with candles that gave no warmth, children seated in rows, shoulders hunched, quills shaking in their hands. No talking, no crying, only the scratching of ink against paper. The children tried to be clever. One claimed he had stolen food. Another wrote she had cursed in her sleep. But Elgin read every confession carefully and marked them, not for what they revealed, but for what they betrayed. The ones who invented soft sins were punished gently. The ones who lied with purity, who said things like, "I let the other children starve," or "I prayed for no one," were punished most. Elgin called this inversion. Suffering not for what you did, but for how well you pretended to be evil. Because only a truly innocent child could lie so convincingly about corruption. Peter recalled his own lie. He wrote that he had pushed another child down the chapel stairs. He thought the horror of the act would protect him. But Elgin smiled when he read it. The punishment came that same night. He was sealed in the silence box again, this time inverted, placed upside down, spine arched, breath drawn through a straw set in the floor. He remained there for hours until the pain became a shape, until thought folded into silence. When he emerged, something had changed. His voice had left him. His bones ached like they'd belonged to someone else. And the next morning he couldn't remember the name of the child he'd written about. Peter said the ritual was repeated for 3 nights. Some children confessed worse things each time. Others refused and were marked as unfinished. One boy wrote, "I dreamed of forgiveness, and disappeared the next day." Elgin called these the holy liars, the ones who sinned only when commanded to. The punishment for them wasn't meant to hurt the body. It was meant to take the part of the soul that still believed pain wasn't holy. Peter looked down when he finished. His voice shook. He said, "I never stopped lying. That's why I'm still here." It happened on a night with no moon. The sky above St. Aveline's hung low and still, as if the clouds themselves were listening. Then, without warning, the bell rang, not forward but backward. A sound that should have marked the start of something instead pulled the air in reverse. Witnesses described the chime not as a toll, but as a pulling. A low spiraling moan that scraped through the walls like metal dragged across glass. Those awake in the chapel froze. The sound was familiar but wrong, like a hymn sung in reverse. It didn't echo. It folded inward, collapsing the space around it. The children stirred first. One boy sat bolt upright in his cot, mouth stretched wide, but no sound came out. His lips remained parted, locked, as if his scream had become frozen inside him. 2 others began pacing in perfect synchronization, murmuring numbers that didn't match the hour. A girl tore pages from her blanket as if convinced it was a book, whispering that she needed to finish her reading before the bell finished ringing. But the bell never stopped. It rang again and again, each toll shorter than the last, as though it wasn't counting time but subtracting it. Elgin did not intervene. According to the final entries in his ledger, he had been expecting it. He called it the reversal hour. He believed time, like sin, could be unraveled with enough precision. The bell, altered through his own manipulations and chained by symbols no clockmaker could interpret, had become more than a tool for marking time. It was now a doorway into its undoing. He wrote that by ringing it backward he could expose the soul's true shape, not shaped by memory but by what it forgot. The effects were immediate. Some children began to age before the eyes of others. Skin loosening, hair graying, backs bending in slow, fluid arches. One boy aged nearly a decade in the span of minutes, then collapsed, his hands clutched around nothing. Others stopped moving altogether, their bodies becoming stiff, eyes open and blank. They weren't dead. They were stuck, caught in some loop their minds couldn't escape. One girl was heard whispering the same phrase over and over again for hours. "He's coming down the stairs," though no one ever did. Her feet bled from pacing the same circle until the flesh wore away. By morning, silence ruled the chapel. The bell had stopped sometime just before sunrise, though no one had seen it move. The air was thick with ash, though no fire had burnt. Several of the children had vanished entirely, their cots empty, bedding still warm. Others remained motionless, eyes open but fixed on moments no one else could see. The youngest child had drawn a clock on the wall in her own blood, its hands pointing nowhere. Elgin's final words in the journal read simply, "Time has listened. It no longer wants to keep us." And though the bell would never ring again, some swore that years later, if his name had long been erased, replaced by a number, Saint 13. He was the smallest of them, untouched by the silence boxes, unaffected by the mirror, and immune to the voice of the backward bell. He never cried during the rituals. He never resisted. When forced to kneel before the altar or swallow communion laced with chalk and insects, he did so with the kind of stillness that unsettled even Elgin. The other children began to avoid him, not out of fear, but something closer to awe. They whispered that he never blinked when he slept, that his shadow moved slower than his body, that the marks of punishment never stayed on his skin. In Elgin's journal, the boy was described with a single phrase: too pure to be reshaped. The soul must be surrendered whole. The final ritual was held at midnight. Elgin called it the Great Cleansing. The altar had been prepared with layers of ash and linen, the pews stripped bare and the candles extinguished. Only the bell, which had not rung since the reversal hour, loomed in silence above the chapel rafters, its chains still slick with condensation. The children, now fewer in number, stood shoulder to shoulder, veiled and barefoot, their mouths sealed shut with black wax. Elgin brought Saint 13 forward without force. The boy walked with the ease of someone returning home. He was placed at the center of the altar, arms crossed, eyes open, face calm. Elgin began the incantation, a muttered blend of scripture and reversal phrases, the same words found in the margins of the Flayed Gospel. He anointed the boy's forehead with a mixture of powdered teeth and oil, then placed the red velvet cloth over his chest, the same cloth used during the first silence experiments. As the ritual escalated, the air grew dense. A strange heat radiated from the altar, not fire, but something deeper, as if the space between skin and bone had begun to burn from the inside. The boy did not move. He did not scream, but his body began to change. It started at the fingertips. They darkened, curled inward, and crumbled. Then the arms, the chest, the face, no smoke, no flame. Only the slow collapse of form like paper caught in windless fire. By the time the ritual ended, nothing remained but a neat pile of gray-white ash resting atop the red cloth, completely undisturbed. Elgin did not speak. He simply removed a silver bowl from beneath the altar, scooped the ashes inside, and carried it into the communion chamber. That Sunday the wafers were different, thicker, darker, oddly sweet. The children received them one by one, kneeling in silence, heads bowed, lips trembling. Elgin called it the sacrament of completion. He recorded their reactions meticulously. Some wept silently. One fainted. A few smiled for the first time in months. When the last wafer was consumed, the children stood and turned toward the altar. No one spoke, no one moved. Then, all at once, they applauded, not with sound, but with gesture. A single slow clap, repeated 3 times, palms never meeting, just the motion, just the silence. Elgin bowed his head and wrote one final line in the journal. He is among us now, not in body, but in hunger. Food in the ruin at midnight, you could still feel something pulling behind your ribs, ticking backward. 1 second too slow. By the time Union forces arrived at the edge of the old chapel grounds, the war had officially ended. Flags had been lowered, rifles stacked, and reconstruction papers inked by hands too tired to shake. But what they found at St. Aveline's was something no treaty had prepared them for. The church stood like a ruin sculpted by silence, its bell tower shattered, its stained glass long devoured by weather, and the once vibrant sanctuary now draped in ash and unnatural stillness. Not a single cry, not a footstep, no birds, no wind. Only the thin metallic scent that clung to the chapel stones like something had been burnt clean and then buried under memory. Inside there were no bodies, no bones, not even blood, just long scorch marks etched into the floor in looping symbols, blackened into the stone like wounds trying to close. The pews had been stripped to their frames. The altar stood bare except for a single red cloth, folded perfectly untouched by dust. Beneath it, in a hidden slot built into the pulpit, they found Father Elgin's journal, still warm to the touch as if it had just been sealed. Every page was accounted for, every entry is dated, signed, and stamped with strange symbols. The entries ended the night of the final ritual. There was no mention of where he had gone, no farewell. Just the final sentence scrawled without spacing, "Highs made whole." In the rear of the chapel, beneath the collapsed rafters and warped floorboards, they found a boy. He sat against the wall, arms limp at his sides, face calm but blank, his white hair clinging to his skull like frost that refused to thaw. It was Peter, the hollow boy, though no one knew that yet. He was the only soul left inside the ruin, and though his skin was cold, he breathed. He had no injuries, no signs of starvation, just a silence so complete it seemed to dull the sound of footsteps in the room. He would not speak. He would not look anyone in the eye. When carried out, he curled into himself like a leaf burnt hollow at the stem. Investigators swept the grounds. The basement held remnants of charred wood, melted wax, and faint child-sized scratches in the iron walls. The bell chains were still slick. The silence boxes stood sealed shut. But there were no bodies, no graves. The garden bore no roots. The well gave no water. Every sign of life had been erased. All that remained was Elgin's handwriting, the etched symbols, and the boy who refused to blink. When the records were submitted to the post-war council, the reaction was swift but quiet. Officials cited instability, anomalies caused by starvation, frost, and madness. No formal charges were filed, no trial was convened. The war had left too many dead, too many horrors unnamed. To raise the question of a preacher turned ritualist in a burnt-out chapel would not serve unity. It would only reopen wounds. The journal was sealed in a federal vault marked Deviant Theology, undisclosed. The property was claimed by the government and later listed as structurally unsound, though the foundation never shifted. The building was demolished in name only. No demolition ever occurred. The site was fenced off, but the fence rotted faster than metal should. Locals stopped walking near the grounds. Children whispered about the bell that never fell. And the boy, Peter, was sent north, unnamed and unclaimed, placed in a facility under military oversight, until even that file vanished. When asked years later, one of the soldiers who found the chapel said he still remembered the sound under his boots. He said it wasn't stone. It was something soft, like ash pressed over teeth. He paused, then said he didn't believe in God anymore, not because of the war, but because of what he didn't find, because evil that leaves no trace feels older than sin. It feels practiced, it feels permanent, and the silence never left his ears, not completely. In 1932, the land that once held the chapel was flattened by machines that stalled more than once without cause. The government deed was vague, but the town needed space for a new school. Foundations were poured over old soil that never quite stayed dry, and concrete hardened atop stone that had never truly crumbled. St. Aveline's preparatory school opened that fall with cheerful banners and polished floors. Though children complained of cold spots in the hallways, and teachers noted a strange echo in the gymnasium, an echo that responded a beat too late. For the first few years, nothing unusual reached the surface, but then came the drawings. Hung innocently on classroom walls, they began appearing during free art time. Charcoal sketches of faceless people, crude bells with eyes inside them, and stick figures wearing numbered collars. The images weren't copied from books or shared between students. They appeared in separate classrooms drawn by children who had never spoken to one another. One girl traced the same symbol onto her desk every morning before class, a circle filled with thorns and a clapperless bell in the center. When asked why, she whispered, "So he knows I'm still quiet." In 1946, a teacher stumbled upon a child standing in the supply closet facing the wall, arms crossed over his chest, motionless. He remained unresponsive for 6 hours. When the door was finally opened, the child calmly returned to class and never mentioned the event again. He failed no assignments and showed no signs of trauma, but his handwriting changed. It began to slope backward, left-handed, even though he was right. He wrote his own name in Latin, though he had never studied it. By 1970, the school's foundation required sudden, unexpected renovations due to unexplained subsidence. While digging beneath the south wing, workers uncovered a flat black stone roughly the size of a coffin lid. It bore no date, no carving except for one line pressed into the surface with something blunt and hot. "Here sleep the saintless." The stone was removed and later went missing from municipal storage. The subsidence resolved itself the next week. No repairs were needed. In the years that followed, legislation quietly shifted. Laws regulating isolation practices in child institutions grew stricter, prompted by studies citing early-century anomalies. In 1983, a psychologist testified before a congressional panel, claiming that some children under sensory deprivation displayed signs of shared invented memory, specifically involving symbols not found in their culture. Her testimony was dismissed as inconclusive, but the research file remains sealed to this day. In 1997, the Vatican's secret archives unsealed a document marked "Observation Only." It referenced an unorthodox American priest active during the Civil War era, whose teachings aligned with inverse theological structures, rituals based on subtraction, identity erasure, and purification through reversal. The document named no individual. It cited no location, but a copied journal page matched handwriting later identified as Elgin's. The church never acknowledged it publicly. A brief note at the margin read, "No saint, no martyr, only method. The school still stands. Renovated twice. Renamed once." But janitors report that no matter how many times the east stairwell is repainted, children still scratch numbers into the plaster. Some parents have requested their children be moved after hearing them chant in sleep, soft, backward phrases in voices not their own. And once every few years, an old caretaker passes on a rumor that if you walk through the old south wing at exactly 3:17 a.m., the floor beneath you will feel warm, not like heat, but like breath. There were no graves, no trials, no names etched into stone, but the legacy of the saintless remains, Not in books or sermons, but in silence, in gaps between seconds, in the spaces where sound should be but isn't. Evil does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hums through old walls. And sometimes it prays in perfect stillness, waiting for someone quiet enough to hear its answer.